Do you believe in fate, or do you think some meetings are just accidents? Imagine this: a famous author, Benjamin Edwards, whose novels have moved millions to tears and kept countless readers up all night, decides to escape the chaos of fame and hide in a remote cabin. Sounds like the beginning of a peaceful retreat, doesn't it? But fate had other plans. He hires Evelyn Martinez as his caretaker, a quiet and efficient woman who seems perfect for the job. But here's the twist: he has no idea that she's not just any employee. She's his biggest fan, the kind who's read all his books, who's memorized passages, and who's been secretly inspired by his words during her darkest moments. But wait, there's more to Evelyn than meets the eye. She has a dark secret, one that she's carefully hidden beneath her professional exterior, a secret that connects to the very stories that made Benjamin famous. As they coexist in the cabin, surrounded by the rustling of pine trees and the weight of unspoken truths, the line between employer and employee begins to blur. Their silent exchanges and fleeting glances become a dance of secrets, and slowly building trust. This isn't just a story about a famous author and a mysterious caretaker. It's about the power of stories to heal, to deceive, and to bring together the most unlikely of souls. It's about the masks we wear and the truths that lie beneath. And it's about how sometimes the people we least expect can become the key to unlocking our past and finding our way to redemption. So, are you ready to step into the cabin with Benjamin and Evelyn and discover what happens when a famous author meets his biggest fan with a dark secret? Benjamin Edwards, the acclaimed author whose novels had once set literati circles ablaze with their haunting prose, could no longer stomach the limelight. After his last bestseller, Shadows of the Forgotten, propelled him into a fame he despised, he vanished. His retreat, a weathered cabin nestled in the pine-scented wilderness of Vermont, a place where the only audience was the wind whispering through skeletal trees. "I'm done being a circus act," he muttered to his agent over a crackling phone line, his voice frayed like the hem of a threadbare sweater. The cabin, with its sagging porch and moss-clad chimney, became his sanctuary. Here, he'd rebuild his fractured creativity, or so he hoped. But the typewriter on his desk sat silent, its keys mocking him with their accusing gleam. The truth: Benjamin's muse had abandoned him years ago, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man who'd rather battle writer's block than face the world he'd helped create. Fame built on grief had always been his double-edged sword. The move wasn't just about escaping paparazzi drones buzzing like angry hornets. It was about outrunning the ghosts, his brother's ghost mostly, Julian Edwards, the man who'd whispered stories into Benjamin's ear since childhood, whose laughter had once echoed through their shared attic hideout. "Julian, the real architect of every novel Benjamin had ever published. You'll keep his legacy alive," Julian had pleaded on his deathbed, his fingers clutching Benjamin's like a lifeline, and Benjamin had promised. But now, surrounded by Julian's old journals, their spines cracked like dried riverbeds, Benjamin wondered if he'd become a prisoner of that promise. The cabin's isolation was supposed to be a cure. Instead, it felt like a gilded cage. Ghost-written legacy weighed on his conscience like a millstone. Days blurred into nights as Benjamin paced the cabin's creaky floorboards, his coffee growing cold in forgotten mugs. He'd stare at the blank page, fighting the creeping suspicion that every word he'd ever written was a lie. The publisher's deadlines loomed like thunderclouds. Just one sentence, he'd plead to the air, but the only response was the howl of the wind. Author's dark secret gnawed at him, a secret that had festered for a decade. What if someone discovered the truth? What if the world realized Benjamin Edwards was nothing more than a vessel, a placeholder for Julian's genius? The fear curdled in his gut, sharp as vinegar. Yet, in the dead of night, when the moon painted the cabin silver, he'd catch himself, smiling at the memory of Julian's joy when their first novel sold, Storytelling redemption had once been their shared dream. Now it was Benjamin's cross to bear. The caretaker's arrival was a flicker of change in his monochrome routine. Evelyn Martinez drove up in a battered Jeep, her eyes scanning the property with the precision of someone who'd memorized every inch of a blueprint. She was all brisk efficiency, no small talk, no wide-eyed fandom, just a firm handshake and a nod. "He'll keep the place running," she said, her voice a smooth stone skipping over water. Benjamin didn't ask how she'd found the job posting. He didn't care. Her presence was a neutral equation in his equation of solitude. Caretaker's discovery. He doubted she'd discover anything. No one ever did, except there was something in her gaze, a flicker of recognition he couldn't place. By week 3, Benjamin had fallen into a rhythm. He'd write in bursts, fueled by black coffee and the distant scent of Evelyn's lavender soap wafting from the laundry room. Their interactions were brief, a nod here, a thank you there, but each exchange carried the weight of unspoken things. One evening, as rain hammered the windows, Benjamin caught her humming a tune from Julian's favorite folk album. The melody sliced through the silence, raw and familiar. Bond through books began to form, subtle as spider silk, but Benjamin pushed it aside. He didn't do connections, not anymore. The cabin's walls, with their stories etched into every knot of wood, seemed to agree. Mystery in the cabin was best left undisturbed. Evelyn Martinez's hiring wasn't an accident. She'd applied with a resume as sharp as a scalpel, military precision in every detail. Her previous roles, a tapestry of managing remote estates for reclusive artists, each one a testament to her ability to blend into the background. "I maintain systems, not friendships," she had written in her cover letter, a statement that had oddly resonated with Benjamin's own emotional hibernation. When she arrived, her presence was a study in contrasts, her dark hair pinned in a severe bun, her boots scuffed but sturdy, her eyes missing nothing. The cabin seemed to straighten its shoulders under her care. Fan turned confidant? That title would have made her snort. She was here for the job, nothing more, or so she told herself. Her days followed a military-grade schedule. Dawn broke, she was already outside, chopping firewood with a rhythm that spoke of practice. By midday, the cabin gleamed, dust bunnies exiled, floors polished to a shine. Benjamin noticed the little things, the way she'd rearranged Julian's old bookshelf, alphabetically, or how she'd leave fresh berries on his desk in the afternoons. It was methodical, almost ritualistic. But when Benjamin tried to thank her once, she'd merely raised an eyebrow. "It's part of the job," she'd said, her tone clipping. The words like a thread. Unlikely connection? Not on her watch. Yet there were moments, like when she'd find him staring at Julian's photo on the mantelpiece, that her composure would crack. Just a sliver. Enough for Benjamin to wonder. The cabin's history was an open book to Evelyn. She'd discovered Julian's initials, carved into the kitchen table, the hidden compartment in the library floor where Benjamin kept his whiskey, the overgrown garden that once buzzed with Julian's beloved honeybees. Each discovery was logged in her mind, a private archive, but she never mentioned them. What good would it do? Benjamin's silence was a fortress, and Evelyn had long ago mastered the art of respecting boundaries. Still, she'd catch herself humming Julian's old folk tunes while scrubbing the floors, a habit that had stuck with her since she'd first read Benjamin's novels. Hidden truth revealed? No, not yet. Some truth stayed buried, like the reason she'd memorized every sentence of Benjamin's work in the first place. One evening, as Evelyn patched a leak in the roof, Benjamin appeared with a thermos of tea. "You work too hard," he said, his voice edged with something like concern. She accepted the thermos, her fingers brushing his. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a ripple through her. "Someone's got to keep the place from falling apart," she replied, her usual mask sliding back into place. Benjamin studied her for a moment, the corners of his mouth twitching. It was the closest he'd come to a smile since her arrival. Bond through books was a fragile thread, but it existed. Evelyn pushed it aside. Professionalism was her armor. Let Benjamin think what he wanted. She was here for the job, not for ghosts. The dynamic between them was a dance of unspoken rules. Benjamin would write in bursts, the typewriters clatter a rhythmic backdrop to Evelyn's sweeping, shed-leave notes. In the kitchen, firewood restocked, garden weeded, written in a script as precise as her demeanor. But the real communication happened in the silences, the way Benjamin would pause mid-sentence when Evelyn entered the room, the way she'd linger a beat too long when retrieving his laundry. Storytelling redemption. Evelyn wasn't sure Benjamin deserved that. Not yet, but there was a pull, undeniable as gravity. And in the cabin's shadowy corners, where Julian's memory lingered like incense, something was shifting. Evelyn's reverence for Benjamin Edwards was a well-guarded secret, buried deeper than the cellar where Julian's old printing press gathered dust. Every novel Benjamin had published was etched into her memory, the way his words could paint despair with the delicate strokes of hope, how his characters mirrored the fractured beauty of real life. She'd first discovered his work during her darkest days, holed up in a military barracks after a tour that had left her soul scarred. Books behind the mask had been her salvation, each page a band-aid on wounds that refused to heal. Benjamin's stories had become her North Star, guiding her through nights when the ghosts of her past howled loudest. But idolizing her employer, that was a bridge too far. Professionalism was her armor, and she'd be damned if she'd let it slip. Yet, the urge to speak her admiration was a persistent itch. There were moments like when she'd find him lost in thought, his fingers hovering over the typewriter as if summoning spirits that she'd bite her tongue to keep from blurting out, "Your brother would be proud." Because she knew, oh, she knew, the way Benjamin's novels carried a duality, a shadow that Julian's uncredited genius had cast. Author's dark secret wasn't just Benjamin's burden. It was a secret Evelyn had pieced together from whispered rumors and half-read biographies. But exposing it, that would shatter the fragile bond she'd forged. And Evelyn Martinez didn't shatter things she couldn't fix. Her method of homage was subtle, a quiet rebellion masked as duty. She'd polish Julian's old desk until it gleamed like a beacon, arrange his books in the order they'd been published, and even play his favorite folk album on the vintage record player she'd found in the attic. Benjamin never commented, but she'd catch him staring at the record sleeve with a look that mirrored her own longing. Ghost-written legacy hung between them, thick as the pine resin that sometimes dripped from the cabin's rafters. Still, she maintained her poker face. Admiration was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not here, not now. One rainy afternoon, as Evelyn dusted Benjamin's study, a book slipped from the shelf. Whispers in the dark, Benjamin's debut. It fell open to a dog-eared page, revealing a handwritten note in the margin, Julian's favorite scene. He cried when we wrote it. Her breath hitched. The note wasn't signed, but the implications screamed. This was the closest she'd ever come to confirmation. A part of her wanted to march up to Benjamin and demand the truth. But then she'd remember the tremor in his voice, when he'd mentioned Julian's old bee garden, the way his eyes had glossed over. Bond through books was a thread she wasn't ready to pull. Some truths needed time to breathe. By evening, Evelyn had composed herself, her usual efficiency restored. She served Benjamin his dinner, venison stew, a nod to the game he'd hunted days earlier, without a hint of the storm that had raged inside her. "The stew's excellent," he'd said, his rare compliment hanging in the air. Shed merely nodded. Truth versus legacy was a battle neither of them was prepared to fight. Not yet. For now, the cabin's walls held their secrets close, like a mother cradling her children. And Evelyn, She'd keep playing her part, one careful step at a time. The weeks unfurled like a slow-burning fuse, each day a repetition of silent routines. Benjamin would rise at dawn, his shadow stretching across the cabin floor as he made his way to the study. Evelyn would be outside already, tending to the firewood pile or repairing the fence that seemed to demand constant attention. Their mornings were a symphony of unspoken things, Benjamin's typewriter clacking in rhythm with Evelyn's shovel hitting dirt. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was a language they both understood. Mystery in the cabin thrived in those quietudes, weaving itself into the very fabric of their coexistence. Communication, when it occurred, was telegraphic. A raised eyebrow from Evelyn when Benjamin's coffee grew cold. A nod from him when she'd left a fresh batch of muffins by his desk. Once, when a storm knocked out the power, she'd found him fumbling for candles. Without a word, she'd lit the room, her movements precise in the dark. "Thank you," he'd murmured, the gratitude in his voice unexpected. She'd simply shrugged. Unlikely connection. Perhaps. But connections, she'd learned, didn't need grand declarations. They bloomed in the spaces between words. One afternoon, as Evelyn patched a hole in the roof, Benjamin appeared with a ladder. "Let me," he'd said, his offer surprising them both. Shed stepped back, watching as he climbed, his movements awkward but determined. When he'd finished, he'd descended, a sheepish grin tugging at his lips. "Not my strongest suit," he'd admitted. Shed laughed a short, surprised burst of sound that felt alien in the charged air. Broken genius? Benjamin was anything but broken in that moment. He was human, flawed, real, and for the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to see him as more than a legend. The cabin's history became a silent bridge between them. Evelyn would find Benjamin tracing Julian's initials on the kitchen table, his fingers hovering as if afraid to disturb the past. She'd leave him to it, her presence a quiet anchor. One evening, as she restocked the whiskey supply, he'd asked, "Do you believe in ghosts?" The question hung in the air, heavy with subtext. She'd paused, considering. "Only the ones we carry with us," Shed replied, her voice soft. His eyes had met hers, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Storytelling. Redemption wasn't just a concept anymore. It was a thread they were both grasping, though neither knew where it would lead. By the time autumn's chill gripped the Vermont woods, their dynamic had shifted imperceptibly, irrevocably. Benjamin would sometimes find Evelyn in the library after hours, her flashlight sweeping over Julian's old journals. She'd close them swiftly when he entered, her cheeks flushing. He'd pretend not to notice. The evenings grew longer, filled with the crackle of the fireplace and the occasional shared plate of food. They'd talk in fragments about the weather, about books, about nothing and everything. Truth versus legacy still loomed, a specter waiting to be named. But for now, they were content to dance around it, each step bringing them closer to a truth neither could yet face. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day that blended seamlessly into the others. Evelyn had taken to cleaning Benjamin's study in the afternoons, when the sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, turning the room into a chamber of golden particles. She'd developed a routine: dust the shelves, straighten the books, vacuum the floor. But today, as she reached for a stack of papers on the desk, something caught her eye, a loose sheet tucked behind the typewriter. Her fingers closed around it, the paper brittle with age. The handwriting was familiar yet foreign, the strokes hurried as if written in a fever dream. Her throat tightened. This wasn't Benjamin's script. She unfolded the page slowly, as if disturbing a sleeping beast. The first line hit her like a punch. "The wolf's howl is the forest's lament," Julian's voice, unmistakable. She recognized the metaphor from Benjamin's first novel, whispers in the darker book that had launched 1,000 literary analyses. But this was different. Raw, unfiltered. Her eyes darted to the date at the bottom, 3 years before Julian's death. Her heart began to race. These pages weren't just old drafts. They were proof. Hidden truth revealed wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was ink-stained reality. Evelyn spent the next hour in a trance, uncovering more pages stashed in desk drawers, behind books, even under the floorboards. They told a story not just of the novels she'd memorized, but of Julian's inner world. His fears, his dreams, his belief that stories were sacred vessels. Benjamin's role was clear. He'd been the conduit, the translator. But why? The question burned. Had he stolen Julian's words, or had he preserved them? Literary deception or storytelling redemption? The lines blurred as she read. By the time she finished, the room had grown dark. She sat in the dimness. Julian's words a lit match in her hands. What would she do with this fire? The decision to keep the pages wasn't made lightly. She considered burning them, erasing the evidence of Benjamin's double life. But the thought of destroying Julian's worker-man shed, come to admire through Benjamin's stories, felt like a betrayal. She also contemplated confronting Benjamin immediately, but the timing felt off. He was fragile, a fact she'd discerned from the way his hands shook when he thought she wasn't looking. Caretaker's discovery carried weight, and she needed to handle it with the same care she'd applied to maintaining the cabin. So she tucked the pages into her apron pocket, her mind racing. This secret wouldn't stay hidden forever. But for now, it was hers to bear. That night, Evelyn lay in her makeshift bed in the attic, Julian's words echoing in her mind. She thought of Benjamin's quiet moments, the way he'd sometimes press a hand to the study door as if listening for something. Fame built on grief, that's what this was. Benjamin's career, his fame, his very identity had been constructed on the skeletal frame of Julian's genius. And she, who'd built her life around the careful management of chaos, now held the key to dismantling it all. But what would that achieve? Vengeance, justice, or merely another layer of pain? Books behind the mask had taught her that stories were powerful weapons, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to fire hers. Evelyn's initial curiosity had been a spark. The pages she'd discovered turned it into an inferno. She'd retreated to her attic sanctuary, the hidden sheets spread across the floor like sacred texts. Reading them was an act of archaeology, each word a relic unearthed from the past. The stories were familiar, the same narratives that had catapulted Benjamin into literary stardom, but the cadence was different. Julian's voice was earthier, more visceral, less polished. It was the difference between a rough diamond and a cut gem. Benjamin had been the jeweler, refining Julian's raw brilliance into something marketable. But the core, that had always belonged to Julian. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Benjamin Edwards was a ghostwriter in reverse, a man who'd claimed credit for another's soul work. Author's dark secret wasn't just a metaphor anymore. It was her mission statement. She cross-referenced passages from the hidden pages with Benjamin's published works, her fingers flying over the keyboard of her old laptop. The similarities were undeniable. A scene describing a widow's grief in whispers in the dark matched Julian's account of their mother's death, down to the trembling hands and the half-empty glass of whiskey. A metaphor about fireflies guiding lost souls in shadows of the forgotten was lifted verbatim from Julian's journal entry about their childhood adventures. Benjamin hadn't just been inspired by Julian. He'd stolen his very essence. Ghost-written legacy was a theft disguised as tribute, and the literary world had been complicit in the fraud, praising Benjamin's unique voice while Julian rotted in an unmarked grave. The emotional weight of the discovery was paralyzing. Evelyn had always known fame was a fickle mistress, but this was different. Benjamin's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a cosmic injustice. Julian had poured his heart, his trauma, his genius into those pages, and Benjamin had reduced them to commodities. Literary deception didn't begin to cover it. This was a violation of the sacred trust between creator and audience. Yet as she reread Julian's words, so full of life, of pain, of unfiltered truth, she felt a strange protectiveness. These stories deserved to be heard as Julian had intended, not diluted for mass consumption. But could she, a stranger with a military, a past and a knack for maintaining cabins, be the one to right this wrong? The question hung in the air, unanswered but urgent. She considered her options with the clinical precision of a strategist. Option 1, confront Benjamin immediately. The appeal was instant gratification, seeing the truth etched on his face, watching him squirm under the weight of exposure. But the risk was high. He might deny everything, or worse, retreat further into himself, taking Julian's legacy to the grave. Option 2, leak the pages anonymously. This had a certain poetic justice, letting the world discover the truth without her fingerprints on it. But then Benjamin would become a pariah, and Julian's stories might be lost in the scandal. Option 3, confront him privately, give him a chance to come clean. It felt naive, but something about Benjamin's quiet moments suggested he might still have a conscience. Truth versus legacy, the ultimate showdown. She massaged her temples. Whatever she chose, there was no turning back. The decision to wait crystallized during breakfast the next morning. Benjamin entered the kitchen, his usual gaunt frame slightly more hunched, his stubble darker. He poured himself a mug of coffee without looking at her. "I found some old pages in the study," she said casually, breaking the news like an egg, quick and clean. His reaction was instantaneous. His head snapped up, eyes wide, coffee forgotten. "What pages?" he rasped. The fear in his voice was confirmation enough. Hidden truth revealed had become an open wound. But Evelyn simply shrugged, her poker face intact. "Just some handwritten stuff, thought you'd want to know." She left the room, letting the unspoken hang between them. The game had begun. The confession didn't come easily. Days passed in a tense stalemate, Evelyn going about her duties with mechanical precision while Benjamin retreated into himself. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened, the silence now charged with unspoken accusations. Finally, on a moonless night, Benjamin found Evelyn on the porch, her silhouette framed against the dying fire. "You know," he said, his voice a whisper carried on the wind, "about the pages." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I know," she replied. The word hung between them, a challenge and an invitation. Benjamin's story unraveled in fits and starts, each sentence a pebble dropped into a pond. Julian had been the wordsmith, the dreamer, the one who could spin gold from pain, but he'd struggled with mental illness, his brilliance often dimmed by the fog of depression. When publishers rejected his work, citing it as too raw and unmarketable, Benjamin had stepped in. "I wanted to help him," Benjamin said, his voice cracking. "I thought if I polished his stories, made them digestible, we could share them with the world." Fame built on grief, the bitter fruit of well-intentioned deceit. But the plan had backfired. Julian, feeling like a fraud himself, had spiraled. His death, a leap from a cliff during a bout of psychosis, had left Benjamin with a choice. Erase Julian's name entirely or preserve his work under his own. Grief, guilt, and fear had sealed his lips. Evelyn listened, her heart a drumbeat in her ears. Benjamin's tale was a confession, yes, but also a plea for understanding. He wasn't a monster, she realized. He was a broken man who'd made a desperate choice. Broken genius, the perfect epithet for a man who'd sacrificed his soul for his brothers. Legacy, but where did that leave her? With a truth that burned like acid in her possession. She thought of Julian's pages, still hidden in her apron pocket, their ink seeping into the fabric. How many others had Benjamin deceived? How many readers had wept over Julian's words, thinking them Benjamin's? The ethical labyrinth stretched endlessly before her. "Why tell me now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tempest inside. Benjamin's eyes dropped to the ground. "Because I can't bear the weight anymore," he admitted. "And I think you deserve the truth." The admission was fragile, a dandelion. Seed in the wind, Evelyn studied him, searching for lies, finding none. Literary deception had been his prison now. He was offering her the key. But freedom came with a price. If they exposed the truth, Benjamin's career would implode. Julian's work might vanish from bookshelves. And Evelyn, she'd become the bearer of a truth that could destroy as much as it could liberate. The fire in her pocket felt heavier than ever. The night wore on, the fire dying to embers as they sat in strained silence. Benjamin's confession hadn't resolved anything, it had merely clarified the stakes. Evelyn stared at the stars, their cold light offering no answers. Storytelling. Redemption, could it still be possible? Or was this the end of a fragile bond? A cabin in the woods, and two souls grappling with the aftermath of a lie. The path forward was shrouded in mist, but one thing was clear: the truth, once tasted, could never be untasted. And Evelyn Martinez, the quiet caretaker with a military past and a penchant for order, now held the power to rewrite history. The days that followed Benjamin's confession were a tightrope walk. Evelyn vacillated between indignation and empathy, her heart and mind locked in a tug-of-war. Part of her demanded justice for Julian, the unseen architect whose genius had been erased from literary history. How many aspiring writers had looked up to Benjamin, unaware they were idolizing a facade? How many times had Julian's raw, unfiltered voice been sanitized for public consumption? The injustice gnawed at her, a relentless hunger. Yet another part of her recognized Benjamin's torment. The way his shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible cross. The way he'd stare into space, as if Julian's ghost were whispering in his ear. Truth versus legacy was no longer an abstract dilemma. It was flesh and blood. She considered the practical implications with her usual military precision. Exposing Benjamin would require irrefutable proof. Julian's pages, cross-referenced with published works, paired with Benjamin's confession. But would that be enough? Publishers, ever protective of their cash cows, might bury the scandal. The media, hungry for drama, could reduce Julian's legacy to a sensationalized footnote. And Benjamin? He'd become a pariah, his career in ruins. But then there was Evelyn's own stake in this. She'd found a purpose in the cabin, a semblance of routine that had begun to heal her own fractured soul. Walking away from this secret might mean walking away from herself. Books behind the mask had once been her salvation. Could they now become her burden? The turning point came during a rare snowfall. Evelyn was shoveling the driveway when Benjamin appeared at the door, a scarf wrapped haphazardly around his neck. "I've been thinking," he said, his breath visible in the cold air, "about the pages, about Julian." She paused, her shovel mid-swing. "And?" she prompted. He hesitated. "Then I want to make things right." The words were simple but monumental. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, not yet, but for a chance to rectify a decades-old wrong. Storytelling redemption wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a flicker of hope in the snow-laden silence, but hope demanded action, and action demanded risk. That evening, they sat at Julian's old kitchen table, the pages spread between them like a map to uncertain terrain. Benjamin spoke with a clarity he'd lacked before. "I want to publish Julian's original manuscripts," he said, untouched, with his name on them. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "And your role?" she asked. He met her gaze steadily. "As his brother, the man who kept his promises, even when it meant losing himself." The transparency was disarming. Ghost-written legacy could be redeemed, but only if they navigated the minefield together. The question was, could Evelyn trust a man whose entire career had been built on deceit The answer eluded her, but the attempt felt necessary. The decision to act hinged on a single moment. As Evelyn reviewed Julian's pages one last time, a particular passage caught her eye. Stories are living things. They need to be free. The words, so like Julian, struck a chord. She glanced at Benjamin, who was tracing Julian's handwriting with a tender reverence. Unlikely connection, their bond, forged in the fires of truth and guilt, felt less unlikely now. They weren't just two strangers in a cabin. They were two souls, burdened by the past, seeking redemption in the written word. The path forward was fraught with peril, but it was a path they'd walk together. Truth versus legacy, the scales had tipped ever so slightly toward truth. The confrontation, when it came, was less a clash and more a gentle unraveling. Evelyn chose. A morning when the cabin was swaddled in fog, the world outside muted, as if holding its breath. She found Benjamin in the study, his fingers hovering over the typewriter as if waiting for words that would never come. "We need to talk about the pages," she said, her voice soft but firm. He stiffened, but didn't turn around. "I know about Julian," she continued. "I know he wrote the stories." The admission hung in the air, a bridge between them. Benjamin's shoulders slumped. "I thought you'd hate me," he murmured. Evelyn's heart clenched. Broken genius, the man before her was anything but whole. But hate, that felt too simple. She approached. Slowly, her boots silent on the worn floorboards. "Hate is easy," she said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Understanding is harder." Her touch was a question. His response was a sigh. "I've spent years building a lie," he admitted. "A lie that became my identity." The vulnerability in his voice was disarming. Evelyn nodded. But lies, no matter how grand, have expiration dates. She withdrew her hand, the moment stretching between them. Benjamin finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. "What do we do now?" he asked. The "we" didn't go unnoticed. Gone through books, their shared burden had become a shared mission. The dialogue that followed was halting but purposeful. Evelyn outlined her thoughts with the clarity of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. "We publish Julian's work under his name," she said. "We tell the truth about your role not as a thief, but as a protector." Benjamin's eyes widened. "And me?" he asked. "Your role?" She smiled faintly. "Your role is to be honest, to let the world see the man behind the mask." Fame built on grief could be dismantled brick by brick and rebuilt on a foundation of truth. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a start. Benjamin's hesitation was palpable. "What if they revile me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's response was immediate. "What if they don't?" She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "What if they see a man who made a mistake but sought to make amends? What if they see Julian's genius finally honored?" The words hung between them, a possibility. And too beautiful to ignore, Benjamin's fingers drummed the desk, a nervous rhythm. "And you?" he asked. "What's in this for you?" Evelyn's answer was simple. "Closure. For Julian. For you. And maybe for me, too." The honesty stunned him. Storytelling redemption wasn't just a concept anymore. It was a shared journey. The decision to act was sealed with a Noden unspoken pact between two souls who'd found an unlikely kinship. In the shadow of a lie, they would face the world together, armed with Julian's words and a fragile but unwavering resolve. The journey ahead would be arduous. The truth, when unveiled, could be a double-edged sword. But for the first time in years, Benjamin felt a glimmer of hope, not for himself, but for his brother and Evelyn. She felt something she hadn't felt since before her military days' purpose. Truth versus legacy, the scales had finally tipped. The confession, when it came, was a release, a dam bursting after years of pressure. Benjamin stood at the cabin's weathered porch, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot as Evelyn listened. His voice carried the weight of decades. Julian was the wordsmith, he began. He had this gift. But the world wasn't ready for his rawness. They wanted something palatable, so I became the translator. I took his stories and made them less him. The admission was a knife twist, but necessary. After he died, I promised to keep his legacy alive. I thought fame would honor him, but it consumed me instead. The words tumbled out, a mix of sorrow and relief. Arthur's dark secret had finally seen the light, not as a weapon, but as a confession. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching with a strange blend of compassion and resolve. "You kept his promises," she said gently. "But at what cost?" Benjamin's laugh was bitter. "The cost of my soul." He gestured to the cabin, to the woods beyond. "This place, it's all I have left of him. But even here, I can't escape the lie." The vulnerability in his voice was raw. Broken genius, the title fit, but it didn't define him. Behind the confession lay a man who tried in his flawed way to protect what he loved. And in that, Evelyn found a flicker of forgiveness. The conversation turned practical as Evelyn's mind began mapping the steps ahead. "We'll need evidence," she said. "The pages you found, his journals, anything that proves his authorship." Benjamin nodded. "I've kept everything, I never thought I'd use it." His reluctance was understandable. These items weren't just proof, they were relics of Julian. But Evelyn was firm. Julian's legacy deserves to be free. She paused, her gaze steady. "And so do you." The words hung between them, a fragile thread of hope. Ghost-written legacy could be redeemed, but only if they faced the storm together. They spent the afternoon in the library, Julian's old haven, sifting through boxes of manuscripts and correspondence. Evelyn's hands trembled as she held a letter dated months before Julian's death. "Benjamin," it read, "I'm tired of fighting. If anything happens to me, promise me you'll share our stories with the world, not as yours, as ours." Benjamin's breath hitched. I promised him that day. But I failed. Evelyn's heart ached. Fame built on grief had been a twisted form of loyalty. But loyalty to a fault was still a betrayal. "You're not failing him now," she said softly. "You're honoring him." The reassurance felt true, but it stung. Benjamin's journey toward redemption was only beginning. As dusk painted the sky in hues of amber and gold, they sat side by side on the cabin steps, the evidence of Julian's genius spread out before them. Benjamin's shoulders were straighter, his posture less burdened. "Thank you," he murmured. Evelyn glanced at him, surprised. "For what?" He smiled faintly. "For not walking away." The moment was charged with unspoken things, a shared mission, a fragile trust, the dawn of something new. Bond through books had evolved from a silent understanding to a partnership forged in truth. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt possible. The origin of the lie was a tapestry woven from the darkest threads of human emotion. Benjamin's confession had laid bare the truth. Julian's death had been the catalyst, the moment when grief and guilt had fused into a monstrous rationale. "After he died, I felt like a part of me had been ripped out," Benjamin explained, his voice raw. His stories were all I had left of him. I couldn't bear the thought of them disappearing into obscurity. The fear had been palpable, a brother's terror of losing the only connection to a soul that had defined his existence. So he'd made a pact with shadows. Fame, built on grief, had been his twisted tribute. Evelyn listened, her mind piecing together the fragments of Benjamin's psyche. The guilt, she understood. It was a familiar specter, having haunted her military days. The need to protect Julian's legacy, that was noble, albeit misplaced. But the method a life built on deceit had poisoned everything it touched. "You thought fame would immortalize him," she said softly. Benjamin nodded. I thought if the world knew his name, he'd never truly be gone. The irony was bitter. Julian's genius had been obscured by Benjamin's fame, his voice drowned by the very thing meant to amplify it. Literary deception had become a gilded cage. The discussion turned to Julian's own struggles. He was brilliant, but fragile, Benjamin said. His mental illness, it colored everything. The way he saw the world, the way he wrote. His stories were his therapy. Evelyn's eyes widened. Then why polish them? Why sanitize his voice? Benjamin's answer was a whisper, because the world rejects what it doesn't understand. I thought by making his stories more accessible, I could save him. The admission was a revelation. Broken genius Julian's brilliance had been both his gift and his curse. Benjamin's intervention, well-intentioned as it was, had stifled the very essence that made Julian's work unique. Evelyn's military training had taught her the value of raw truth, unvarnished by niceties. Stories, like people, shouldn't be edited for convenience, she said, her voice firm. Benjamin's gaze dropped. I see that now. But back then I was desperate. The desperation was a language they both understood. Evelyn had made her own bargains with darkness during her tour choices that still haunted her nights. Truth versus legacy, the dilemma wasn't just Benjamin's. It was universal. How far would one go to protect what they loved? And at what cost? The questions lingered, unanswered, but acknowledged. As the evening deepened, the cabin's walls seemed to breathe with the weight of their revelations. Benjamin's confession had opened a door, but the journey through was still uncertain. What happens next? Evelyn asked, her voice tinged with fatigue. Benjamin's reply was a promise. We tell the truth, all of it. The words were simple, but they carried the force of an oath. Storytelling redemption wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a vow. And as they sat in the dim light, the past and future intertwined in a delicate dance, Evelyn felt a strange peace. Some wounds could never heal, but they could be honored, and in honoring them, perhaps they could find a new way forward. The shift in the conversation was subtle, but seismic. Benjamin's confession had opened a Pandora's box of truths, and now it was Evelyn's turn to bear her scars. She hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. I should tell you why I've always connected to your work, she began. Benjamin's eyes locked onto hers, his attention absolute. It's not just the stories, it's what they represented to me during my darkest days. The words poured out a torrent of memories. She'd kept locked away for years, her deployment to a war-torn region, the isolation, the trauma of watching comrades fall. I found your books in the abandoned outpost, she said. Whispers in the dark became my lifeline. Julian's words, they made me feel less alone. The admission was a vulnerability she rarely allowed. Benjamin's reaction was immediate. Julian's words, he repeated, his voice soft. He always wrote about connection, about finding light in darkness. Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. Your books became my armor. They helped me survive when everything else felt pointless. She paused, her gaze distant. I used to think I was broken beyond repair, but Julian's stories, they showed me that broken things could still be beautiful. The sentiment hung between them, a bridge of shared pain. Books behind the mask had been Evelyn's salvation, just as they'd been Julian's therapy. The parallel was haunting. The honesty unlocked something in Benjamin. I never knew, he said quietly. I had no idea my work, his work, had that kind of impact. Evelyn's smile was bittersweet. That's the thing about stories. They transcend the author's intent. They become whatever the reader needs them to be. Her words carried the weight of experience. Benjamin thought of the countless readers who'd been moved by Julian's words, unaware of the man behind the curtain. Literary deception had shielded them from the truth, but it had also allowed Julian's voice to touch lives. Evelyn's. Evelyn's past wasn't just about trauma. It was about resilience. She spoke of the moments after her return, how the military had labeled her with acronyms that reduced her suffering to a diagnosis, how she'd turned to books as a form of rebellion against the silence. Reading Julian's words, "I felt seen," she said. "I felt understood." Benjamin's eyes glistened. Julian would have been honored. The statement was a bond. Through books, their connection wasn't just about shared pain. It was about the transformative power of stories. Evelyn realized with a start that she'd found in Benjamin something she'd lost long ago, a sense of belonging. The conversation deepened as the night wore on, the cabin's warmth contrasting with the chill outside. Evelyn's revelations had stripped away layers of pretense, leaving two souls raw and exposed. Benjamin's voice was unsteady when he spoke next. "You said Julian's stories helped you survive. What about you? Do you write?" Evelyn's laughter was short. Military reports don't count. But Benjamin's persistence was gentle. What if they did? What if your story could help someone the way Julian's helped you? The question lingered, a seed planted in fertile soil. Storytelling redemption wasn't just for Benjamin. It was for Evelyn too. The bond that formed between Benjamin and Evelyn was a quiet revolution, a shift from employer and employee to kindred spirits united by the written word. It began with shared moments in the cabin's library, where Evelyn would read aloud passages from Julian's manuscripts, her voice infusing them with a new vitality. Benjamin would listen, sometimes correcting a mispronunciation, sometimes lost in memories of Julian's laughter. The act of reading together became a ritual, a bridge between past and present. Mystery in the cabin slowly dissolved, replaced by a fragile but growing trust. Their conversations deepened, branching into philosophical territory that surprised them both. Benjamin would speak of Julian's belief that stories were living entities, evolving with each reader. Evelyn would counter with her military perspective that stories were survival tools, maps through the chaos of existence. "Julian would have loved your take," Benjamin said one evening, his tone warm. Evelyn shrugged, but her cheeks flushed. The praise, rare and genuine, felt like a salve. Unlikely connection, their bond defied logic but thrived on shared passion. One afternoon, as they debated the merits of different literary styles, Evelyn challenged Benjamin's tendency to sanitize Julian's raw passages. "Why tone down the pain?" she asked. "Isn't that where the truth lives?" Benjamin's answer was thoughtful. "Julian's pain was specific to him. By softening it, I made it universal." Evelyn's response was immediate. But universality comes from specificity. The more personal the story, the more people recognize themselves in it. The exchange wasn't just about literature, it was about understanding each other's worlds. Storytelling redemption was becoming a collaborative journey. The turning point came during a rare thunderstorm that left them stranded indoors. As lightning illuminated the cabin, Benjamin found himself confessing something he'd never shared, not even with Julian. "I've always been jealous of your ability to face the chaos, Hedden," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. Evelyn stilled. "Jealous? Of me?" Benjamin nodded. "You've lived through hell and still find meaning in stories. I've hidden behind words my entire life." His honesty disarmed her broken genius. She saw it now not as a flaw, but as a wound that could heal. The admission marked a shift. They were no longer just two people sharing a passion. They were partners in healing. By the time winter's first snow blanketed the Vermont landscape, their bond had deepened into something akin to familial affection. They'd begun leaving notes for each other, Julian's old poems, passages from Evelyn's favorite war novels, each one a silent gesture of connection. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Evelyn placed a small notebook on Benjamin's desk. "For you," she said. Inside were her own reflections on Julian's work, written with the same precision she had once reserved for military reports. Benjamin's eyes, welled with tears, bond through. Books, their connection had become a language unto itself, one that needed no translation. The decision to come clean wasn't abrupt. It began as a whispered possibility, a what if that hung in the air during a quiet evening in the library. Benjamin had been tracing Julian's handwriting in an old journal when Evelyn spoke. "What if we told the world?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with anticipation. Benjamin's head snapped up. "Told them what?" he replied, though he knew exactly what she meant. The question was a catalyst, igniting a discussion that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. Truth versus legacy, they were finally ready to face it head-on. The planning was meticulous, Evelyn's military precision clashing with Benjamin's more contemplative approach. "We'll need irrefutable proof," she insisted. "Julian's manuscripts, your correspondence, the publisher's records." Benjamin nodded, though. The prospect of unearthing those documents felt like excavating a grave. "And we'll need a platform," he added. "A book, a public statement." Evelyn's eyes lit up. "A book," she repeated. "Not just any book. Julian's original work, published with his name, alongside your confession." The vision was clear, but daunting. Ghost-written. Legacy could be redeemed, but only if they navigated the minefield together. Doubts crept in, as they always do when vulnerability meets reality. "What if they don't believe us?" Benjamin asked, his voice heavy with fear. Evelyn's response was pragmatic. "They'll question the motives, they'll dig into our pasts. But if the evidence is solid, the truth will prevail." Her confidence was a lifeline. Benjamin thought of the thousands of readers who'd been moved by Julian's words, unaware of the man behind the curtain. Fame, built on grief, had been a double-edged sword, but it had also amplified Julian's voice. Could the truth do the same? The question lingered, but the resolve remained. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Evelyn suggested including her own story in the book. "My journey with your work," she explained. "How Julian's words helped me heal. It would show the impact of his legacy beyond the fame." Benjamin's eyes widened. "You do that?" he asked, touched. Evelyn nodded. "It's only fair. Your brother's stories changed my life. The least I can do is help honor his memory." The decision felt right. Storytelling redemption wasn't just about Benjamin's redemption. It was about giving Julian's genius the recognition it deserved and showing how art could transcend even the darkest of origins. As the evening deepened, the cabin's atmosphere shifted. The weight of secrecy began to lift, replaced by a tentative optimism. Benjamin's voice, usually guarded, softened. "I never thought it'd see this day," he admitted. Evelyn smiled, faintly. "Neither did I. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time it felt possible." They spent the next few hours mapping out the book's structure, Julian's original manuscripts, Benjamin's confession, Evelyn's testimony, and a final section exploring the ethics of literary legacy. Books Behind the Mask would finally reveal its true face. The work was daunting, but the partnership felt invincible. The book, titled Behind the Mask, a story of grief, deception, and redemption, became their magnum opus, a labor of love and truth that consumed the Vermont winter. Benjamin poured his heart into writing Julian's story, not as a tragedy, but as a celebration of his genius. Evelyn contributed her own chapters, detailing how Julian's words had become her lifeline during her darkest days. Together, they crafted a narrative that was equal parts confession and homage, a testament to the transformative power of storytelling. Storytelling redemption had evolved from a distant hope to a tangible reality. The process wasn't without its challenges. Benjamin's writer's block resurfaced with a vengeance, his hands often frozen over the keyboard. Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, implemented a routine morning writing sessions, afternoon walks in the snowy woods, evenings devoted to editing. Even soldiers need structure in battle, shed tease, her military background surfacing. Benjamin would laugh, the sound a rare melody in the cabin. The dynamic between them had shifted. They were collaborators, equals in a mission that transcended their individual stories. One particularly difficult passage, a chapter detailing Julian's struggle with mental illness, had Benjamin unraveling at the seams. "I can't do this," he muttered, crumpling pages into balls. Evelyn stepped in, her calm steadying him. "Focus on the truth, not the pain," she advised. Julian wouldn't want his suffering to define him. Her words resonated. Benjamin rewrote the section with a clarity he hadn't known he possessed. Broken genius Julian's story deserved to be told with the same compassion he'd shown his characters. A breakthrough was a turning point. The book began to take shape, its pages a mosaic of truth and healing. As the manuscript neared completion, they faced the inevitable question of publication. "We'll need a reputable press," Evelyn said, her eyes scanning a list of literary agencies. Benjamin's hesitation was palpable. "What if they reject us?" he asked. Evelyn's response was firm. "Then we self-publish. The truth deserves to see the light regardless of the channel." Her determination was infectious. Benjamin nodded. Truth versus legacy. The scales had finally tipped. They sent query letters, prepared for the worst, but hopeful for the best. The waiting was agony, but the cabin's tranquility provided a balm. The acceptance letter arrived on a crisp spring morning, its envelope trembling in Evelyn's hands. Benjamin stood beside her, his breath hitching as she opened it. The words inside were everything they'd hoped for: praise for the manuscript's courage and depth, an offer to publish with full creative control. They stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of their achievement settling in. Fame built on grief was about to be dismantled, brick by brick, and rebuilt on a foundation of truth. The journey had been arduous, but the reward was within reach. Julian's legacy, once buried in the shadows, was finally set to shine. The book's release was a seismic event, its truths rippling through the literary world like a stone dropped in a pond. Headlines blared famed authors, dark secret exposed brothers, genius revealed, from deception to redemption, the untold story behind best-selling novels. The initial response was a whirlwind of controversy. Readers felt betrayed, critics dissected, motives and literary circles debated the ethics of Benjamin's actions. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected emerged, a chorus of voices celebrating Julian's genius. Ghost-written legacy had been uncovered, and the world was eager to embrace it. Benjamin's public confession, delivered during a televised interview, was a masterclass in vulnerability. "I did what I thought would honor my brother," he said, his voice steady, "but I was wrong. The greatest honor would have been to let his voice speak for itself." The admission resonated with millions, turning public perception from outrage to empathy. Author's dark secret became a symbol not of shame, but of the universal struggle to protect what one loves, even at great personal cost. Benjamin's redemption wasn't complete, but it had begun. Evelyn's role in the story captured hearts. Her journey from traumatized soldier to the woman who'd helped uncover Julian's legacy became a narrative of resilience. Interviews showcased her quiet strength, her military precision juxtaposed with her passion for literature. "Julian's stories saved me," she said simply. "Now I'm helping save his legacy." The authenticity of her words struck a chord. Bond through. Books became a rallying cry for readers who'd found solace in Julian's work. The book's sales soared, but more importantly, Julian's original manuscripts, published posthumously, became bestsellers in their own right. The impact extended far beyond bookshelves. The story inspired conversations about mental health, the ethics of creative collaboration, and the true nature of legacy. Schools incorporated Behind the Mask into their curricula, using it to teach about integrity and the power of truth. Support groups formed for writers who'd struggled with similar ethical dilemmas. Storytelling redemption had transcended its origins, becoming a movement. Benjamin and Evelyn, once strangers bound by secrecy, now traveled the world together, advocating for transparency in art and the recognition of unsung voices. For Benjamin and Evelyn, the journey had been transformative. Benjamin, once a recluse haunted by guilt, found purpose in honoring his brother's legacy. He established the Julian Edwards Literary Fund, granting opportunities to emerging writers whose voices might otherwise go unheard. Evelyn, who'd once buried her pain behind a military mask, discovered a new passion for writing, penning a memoir that blended her wartime experiences with her love for literature. Truth versus legacy, they'd chosen truth, and in doing so, had found a legacy worth carrying forward. The cabin in Vermont, once a prison of secrets, became a symbol of renewal, and in its walls, the spirit of Julian Edwards lived on, his stories finally free. Hey there, book lovers and mystery enthusiasts. We've just unraveled an incredible tale of secrets, healing, and the transformative power of stories. Benjamin Edwards and Evelyn Martinez's journey from strangers, bound by a dark secret, to partners in truth and redemption, shows us that even the most unlikely connections can lead to profound change. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt the weight of a secret, the ache of grief, or the hope that comes with a fresh start, then you know how powerful stories can be. Share with us in the comments what impacted you the most. Did you see yourself in Benjamin's struggle for redemption, or perhaps in Evelyn's quiet resilience? And let us know, were you expecting this kind of ending, or did the twist catch you off guard? Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the ride and found inspiration in Benjamin and Evelyn's journey. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you more stories that touch the heart and spark the imagination. Also, if you're craving more tales of literary twists and unexpected connections, make sure to follow our channel. We've got more incredible stories lined up that will take you on emotional journeys you won't soon forget. Remember, the best stories are the ones that change us, and this is just the beginning.